Roguelikes are great. They're also incredibly confusing to talk about. The game on screen, Goner, isn't even really a roguelike. Let's see why that is. Or put simply, let's look at a brief history on roguelikes. First we have to talk about Rogue though. In order to properly understand Rogue, and by extension roguelikes, it's important to have a historical context, that context being the Curses API, one of the main factors in Rogue's development. Upon cursor optimization, Curses was a programming library developed by Ken Arnold. In the late 70s, video terminals would have proprietary methods of handling cursor movement. To explain, on one terminal, the user would need to input this in order to move the cursor up one line. Meanwhile, on a terminal developed by a different company, the user would need to input this to accomplish the exact same thing. Naturally, this becomes a huge waste of time as soon as a more diverse cast of video terminals are introduced into the fold. The more diversity in terminals, the more diversity in codes to accomplish the exact same thing. Curses was developed to solve this exact problem. To put it simply, programs would make a call to the Curses library, who would then sort out the proper command for your given terminal. While meant for programming, Curses turned out to be a decent tool for use in games. Using Curses as a graphical interface, Glenn Wickman and Michael Toy developed and released the first version of Rogue on the open source distribution 4.2 of BSD Unix in 1980. Over the next 3 years, Rogue's popularity exploded across university campuses, which largely used BSD Unix 4.2 for their computers. Commercial releases of Rogue soon followed, with ports to the Apple Macintosh, Atari ST, and Commodore Amiga, among others, all of which failed spectacularly. The commercial releases of Rogue were hampered by piracy and then outdated graphics when compared to newly released sprite-based games. Despite being a commercial failure, Rogue was soon to be succeeded by a wave of similar games. Hack and Moira, released in 1982 and 3 respectively, aped the procedural generation and permadeath of Rogue, and created a small-scale scene of copycat games in the process. This scene would later become the subgenre known as roguelikes. The term roguelike began getting traction in the early 90s on Usenet to categorize single-user fantasy role-playing computer games, generally set in a dungeon, run with a simple graphic interface. Rogue, Hack, and Moira were just a few of the games under this umbrella description. Rogue was chosen as the namesake of the genre as it was the oldest and most popular. Gradually, the term grew to describe a larger genre as more and more games mimicked roguelike design sensibilities. The second wave of roguelikes consisted of games like Ongbond, NetHack, and Adom, all of which are still popular to this day. Roguelikes weren't exclusive to the West, though. At the exact same time that roguelikes were gaining steam in the US, Mystery Dungeon, a mammoth series in the genre, had been doing the same in Japan. The first release in the Mystery Dungeon series was in 1993 under the Dragon Quest property. Torneko's Great Adventure, Mystery Dungeon, was released in Japan only for the Super Famicom. This was followed up in '95 with Mystery Dungeon, Shiren the Wanderer, also on the Famicom, and Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon for the PlayStation. Dragon Quest, Shiren, and Chocobo all saw consistent releases, though mostly staying localized to the Japanese market. The Mystery Dungeon games waited in relative obscurity as Japanese roguelikes until 2006, with the North American and PAL releases of the first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, Pokemon Blue and Red Rescue Team. The Pokemon pillar of Mystery Dungeon would see huge success in the West, and would see an international release with almost every new title. As time went on, a well-established base of developers grew and gathered online to share their games and introduce newcomers into the scene. 7-day roguelike challenges and plentiful tutorials encouraged the community to create and share games constantly. The simplicity of creating roguelikes meant that anybody could be a developer. In 2008, the first International Roguelike Development Conference was held in Berlin. Here, discussion was hosted to determine exactly what makes a roguelike. This became known as the 15-point Berlin interpretation, and is the root of most of the confusion around the genre. The Berlin interpretation is comprised of high and low value factors when grading games as roguelikeness, these being random environment generation, permadeath, turn-based, grid-based, non-modal, complexity, resource management, hack and slash, exploration and discovery, with low value factors being a single player character, monsters that are similar to players, tactical challenge, ASCII display, dungeons, and numbers. In theory, this should make defining a roguelike clear and concise. In practice, not so much. Here comes the confusing part. Coincidentally, Spelunky was also released in 2008 and immediately challenged the Berlin interpretation as a first in the new wave of roguelikes. Developed by Derek Yu, Spelunky is a side-scrolling platformer in which the main goal is to collect as much treasure as possible, attaining a high score in the process. Originally developed as two separate games, Spelunky became a synthesis of roguelike and platformer, becoming something wholly unique in the process.
I think the first thing was just figuring out how roguelikes and platformers were going to fit together, because they're two very different genres. And what I realized was with roguelikes, what interests me is not that they're top-down dungeon crawlers, turn-based. That part just really, to me, didn't hold the essence of them. To me, it was much more high concept.
Spelunky fails 10 of the 15 factors in the Berlin interpretation, though it still retained 2 of the highest valued factors, procedural generation and permadeath. At 33% is far from a pass though, so surely it couldn't be considered a proper roguelike, right? Despite undoubtedly borrowing from the genre's core design sensibilities, it was far gone from any real roguelike at the time. Unlike the copycat nature of first and second wave roguelikes, Spelunky opted not to iterate on roguelike design, but rather transform it. What resulted was the creation of a new subgenre, the roguelite, as well as the terribly named roguelite-like, but more on that later. While roguelikes still received consistent developments, roguelites moved into the spotlight with mainstream successes left and right. One such success was The Binding of Isaac, which exploded onto the scene in 2011, becoming the poster child for future roguelite releases and kickstarting the roguelite renaissance of the 2010s. Smaller successes like FTL and Risk of Rain were releasing endlessly, and married roguelike design with popular genres like rhythm games, brawlers, and bullet hells. Just to name a few, diluting the formula to be near all-encompassing in the process. To be considered a roguelite, a game need only incorporate procedural generation, permadeath, and incremental character progression into their design, though even those are up for debate. The subgenre is not without some structure though. There are absolutely games that are definitively not roguelites, despite undoubtedly borrowing from them. Here comes that confusing term again. If roguelites were defined by grafting other genres onto roguelike design, roguelite-likes were the exact opposite, genres incorporating roguelike design into them. These are games like the recent XCOM sequels or anything else with a permadeath mode or procedural generation. While not a proper genre, roguelite-likes are evidence that roguelikes are having an ever-increasing influence on modern game design. The roguelite renaissance acted as an antithesis to the strict guidelines for classic roguelikes. Not to be overshadowed, proper roguelikes went through several reforms in response. In 2013, roguelike developer, podcaster, and writer for Tome, Darren Gray, wrote a post on his blog denouncing the Berlin interpretation. Gray made the argument that the Berlin interpretation was outdated and wishy-washy with its criteria, and ultimately harmful to the roguelike genre. One key complaint lodged against it was the irrelevancy of ASCII visuals to roguelike gameplay. Quote, "It's like saying platformers have to have pixel graphics, because all the old platformers had pixel graphics." What followed were several reforms to the definition of a classic roguelike, and the integration of modern roguelikes into the canon, which brings us to today. The Berlin interpretation was cut down to 7 criteria in 2014 and 4 criteria in 2018, following a talk at the 2017 Roguelike celebration. The most recent interpretation being outlined in a post by Santiago Zapata on the Temple of Roguelike fan site. A far cry from the Berlin interpretation, the 4 criteria in Zapata's interpretation were permanent consequences, character centricity, procedural content, and turn-based gameplay. These reforms were more inclusive to the most recent wave of modern roguelikes being released, like Tangledeep, Dungeons of Dreadmore, Mid-Boss, and Dungeon Mans, all of which introduced more sophisticated visuals while still maintaining a firm foothold in the now strict definitions. Simply put, modern roguelikes act as a natural evolution on the roguelike formula. That's not to say that ASCII visuals were completely abandoned though. Classic roguelikes that still adhere to much of the Berlin interpretation are still being released, with examples like Hack, Caves of Cut and Cogmind, along with frequent updates to traditional roguelikes like Tome and Eidom. Many purists still cling to the classic aesthetic of roguelikes of yore. At this point, roguelikes have reached a level of market saturation unprecedented in the genre's history. At the date of writing, over 70 roguelikes have been released on Steam in 2018 alone. The Spelunky re-release has shipped 1 million copies across several platforms, and the original Binding of Isaac shipped more than double that. That same explosion of popularity that the original Rogue experienced in the 80s is present tenfold in today's market, thanks to roguelites and an increased interest in the genre. So say you've had your fill of Isaac or FTL, what's your best way to enter the genre of roguelikes? Modern roguelikes are definitely your best bet. Start with Dungeons of Dreadmore, Eidom, or Tangledeep if early access doesn't scare you off. From there, work backwards down the timeline. Oftentimes the older a roguelike, the more anachronistic it'll be. By working backwards, you'll desensitize yourself to some of the odder aspects in these games. Once you get used to the genre, the world is yours. Roguelikes are plentiful, and often developers will have more than one on their resume, so if one finds your fancy, it's likely their other work will too. In the description I've included a torrent with over 700 free and open source roguelikes to choose from, my favorite being Doomrel, a roguelike remake of the original Doom. Be sure to see so that everyone can enjoy. If you'd like to participate in the larger community or do some further reading, check out Rogue Basin. It's a forum dedicated to roguelikes and roguelike development. Oftentimes larger forums will have general threads dedicated to the genre as well, though they aren't always the most active. Finally, the community's most recent 7-day roguelike challenge happened for the first time over on itch.io recently. With over 150 entries, there are definitely more than a few gems. To close, I think that everyone should at least try roguelikes. They bring such rich experiences with nigh infinite replayability. Plus the community is one of the most accepting and smartest I've ever seen. It's not uncommon that a roguelike developer will be an academic in some form or another. Check out the description for further reading and footnotes created by me. I'll be uploading those in the next coming days. Thanks so much for watching, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like more content like this.